Good evening. How are we doing across the land and around the world? It's great to be with you, my holy brothers and sisters. Got a beautiful daf for you this evening. We're going to finish Mishnah number 1 of chapter 17 and tractate Shabbos, and we're going to complete Mishnah number 2 as well and get into a discussion of Mishnah number 3. We're holding on page 123, Kuf Chaf Gimel of tractate Shabbos. Let us light up the darkness. All right, who's in the house with us this evening? Ooh, a healthy sized crowd, I must say. James Roth says shalom from Indianapolis. Yehudit Sobel, shalom from Florence, South Carolina. Leslie Ann Landsberg from Texas. Bill Eldridge, hello from Berkeley. Paula Schmidt-Klauser says shalom from Chicago. Clay Cordell from South Carolina. Lucy Ram Johnson says shalom from Minneapolis. Jenya Bressler says shalom from New York. Brandon Christian Sullivan from Knoxville. Janice Beanstalk from Southern California. Melissa Itel-Jurin from Great Neck, New York. Kathy Roy from Rucker, Oklahoma. Jonathan Hine from St. Paul, Minnesota. Stephen Giguere from Dover, New Hampshire. Arnold Albin says good evening in the house from Northridge. Maria Emma from Phoenix, Arizona. Mike Schofler says night kayaking and Talmud. Thanks, Sal. Great to be together with you guys. This is awesome. We've got a busy daf to cover, so let's get right into it. Before I actually do that, I want to mention, it's related to our daf today, but a question came up in yesterday's show asking, can we wind a watch? I think actually the question was, can we wind the clock on Shabbos? And the related question, can we wind a watch? And I wasn't sure. I remember looking it up and I was embarrassed I didn't have the answer. And I looked it up later and I realized I didn't have the answer ready at my fingertips. It's not a simple answer, of course. The simplest part of the answer is no, you can't wind a watch. You can't wind a clock on Shabbos, particularly if it has stopped, right? So if it's already stopped and you're going to wind it to make it go, so that's for sure a no-go on Shabbos. The question that comes up, the reason I had looked this up some time ago, is because I wear a mechanical watch, right? People who like to use mechanical watches, in this digital electronic age, sometimes it's nice to have a nice timepiece on your wrist. Specifically what's called an automatic watch. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a watch that has a self-winding mechanism, a mechanical self-winding mechanism. So if I do this, if I just move around, if I simply walk around and do whatever else I'm doing, the watch, because it's moving, winds itself. So if we're not allowed to wind a watch or a clock, particularly if it has stopped, but even just to wind a watch, we don't do it. Can we wear a mechanical watch that winds itself using the power of our motion, just walking around, moving my arms? It's winding the watch on Shabbos. So you might think, okay, I can't really wind a watch, so I shouldn't wear a mechanical watch that uses the motion of my body to wind the watch on Shabbos. And the answer is we may wear a mechanical watch on Shabbos. Why? Number one, we don't wind it on purpose, right? It's an unintended consequence of our moving. We're just moving around. The watch happens to be drawing power from our kinetic motion as we move on Shabbos, but that's an unintended consequence. I'm moving around. I'm just moving around my home or taking a walk around the block. The watch is drawing power from that. That is an unintended consequence of my intention, which is just to walk around. Number two, it's an unwanted consequence. I'm not moving around so that I wind my watch. Moreover, since winding a watch itself is prohibited, but winding from stop, for sure, prohibited. So you couldn't take a watch that has stopped and put it on. You wouldn't do that. But even winding, by many opinions, you just wouldn't do it, using the crown to wind it. So because winding is something that we don't do, the direct action of winding the watch, winding it as an unintended consequence of having it on my wrist and moving around is actually an unwanted consequence. And that's another reason why it's permitted. It's odd, right? But because I'm definitely not moving or wearing the watch in order to wind it, it's unintended and an unwanted consequence. Number three, we're not winding the watch in the normal manner. And here, this is definitely relating to our discussion that we're having now about Muktzeh items, right? Items that have no direct use on Shabbos, and we may use them for a different use than their normal use. Or we may, for example, if a cell phone has no legitimate use on Shabbos, right? So this is an item that on Shabbos is definitely Muktzeh. If it's lying on a tabletop, let's say on the dining table where I'm going to go eat my dinner, somehow it got left there, and now we need to move it off the table so that we can put down the tablecloth and the nice Shabbos dishes and have a meal. So it's a Muktzeh item, but what I need is not the item, I need its place. So I'm going to move it in an atypical manner. Rather than just pick up the phone, I might, like take a napkin or something and pick it up with the napkin. Or I might pick it up with my left hand and hold it with my thumb and pinky. Something odd like that to demonstrate that I know it's Shabbos and I'm not even thinking about using my phone. I just need its place. So I'm going to pick it up in an atypical or backhanded manner. And of course, nothing is more backhanded as a method of winding a watch than wearing it on the back of one's hand, where it just simply gets wound incidentally while we're moving. So it's not the normal way of winding. And finally, the fourth reason why it's permitted to wear the mechanical watch is because the idea that something is muktzeh or that we don't wind a watch, that's really by rabbinic decree, and we're going to be lenient with rabbinic decrees when there's a doubt, whereas when something is a possible violation of a Torah obligation or a Torah prohibition, there in cases of doubt, we're going to be stringent. That's a general principle. In cases of doubt with a Torah law, we're stringent. In cases of doubt with a rabbinic decree, we're lenient. And all of this, of course, is assuming that I'm wearing a watch that was already running. If a watch was stopped, I wouldn't pick it up on Shabbos, put it on my wrist, and start walking around knowing that that watch was then going to be started and be set in motion. And now it's not just sort of, something that's happening indirectly. Now I've picked it up and directly caused a watch to start running that's going to acquire power as I move around, and that's going to help it keep moving after Shabbos. So there's a number of different principles at play there, but the simple answer is no, we do not wind a watch, we do not wind a clock on Shabbos, but we may wear a mechanical watch that derives it gets wound incidentally through our movement. Okay, just wanted to address that since the question came up yesterday. Now let's get back to Muktzeh. This chapter 17 is about this principle of Muktzeh. And generally speaking, something that has no Shabbos use, something that is normally used for a kind of labor that is prohibited on Shabbos. So ideally, we'd like to just not even touch that thing at all. The general principle being that if I pick it up, I might come to violate Shabbos since it's primarily used for things that violate Shabbos. And of course, the classic example is any kind of a tool, like any kind of carpenter's tool or a plumber's tool, an electrician's tool. Anything that's used for work that we do during the week, we don't want to use it on Shabbos. That means it's Muktzeh. Likewise, there are things that we don't want to pick them up, do not even touch them, because we might come to carry them from one place to another and violate the prohibited labor of carrying on Shabbos. But here in this chapter 17, having understood the principle, we're also going to enumerate a number of exceptions to that and the reasoning behind the exceptions. So, the first one is that we may use an object which is designed to be used in a labor that's prohibited on Shabbos, but on Shabbos it can be used for something that is a permitted labor, a permitted effort. And so the example that we're dealing with now, and it's in the title of today's show, is a hammer. So a hammer that's, let's say, a carpenter's hammer that's normally used for hammering nails. Obviously, we're not going to hammer nails on Shabbos. That's the forbidden labor of construction. But we might use it to crack walnuts. So that would be okay. We can use that hammer generally designed for the prohibited labor, prohibited labor on Shabbos of construction. Now we can use it for the permitted labor on Shabbos of cracking open nuts. But now we're going to have an exception to the exception. I'll just get into it. I'll skip forward to that. So a hammer can be used to crack nuts. But which hammer? What kind of hammer? Is there a difference between one hammer and another? And what we're going to get to is that a goldsmith, his hammer, what does he care about? The hammer has to be very smooth so that he can hammer gold in a very smooth way and get a nice even surface of the gold. Will a walnut create a dent in his hammer? No, it appears that no, it would not. So a goldsmith's hammer can be used to crack nuts on Shabbos. What about a spice merchant? A spice merchant's hammer, it's not so much the issue is that it has to remain smooth. It's that a spice merchant's hammer is used for hammering very expensive spices during the week. If we use it to crack nuts on Shabbos, some of the aroma or the taste of the nuts might penetrate the striking surface of the hammer. Now that's something that the spice merchant would not want. He doesn't want any kind of impurities from nuts or anything else, even wood on the table, anything, to get into his hammer, because that could diminish the value of the spices that he hammers during the week. So now we've encountered the principle of something that is set aside because of monetary loss, right? The spice merchant has it in his mind that he doesn't use his hammer for anything other than spices, lest the hammer become damaged. So as he heads into Shabbos, in his mind, that hammer is strictly set aside. So even though it could be used to hammer nuts, we wouldn't use it to hammer nuts. That is a strictly Muktzeh item. It is strictly set aside and therefore not prepared for use on Shabbos. Other examples that come up, a mortar and pestle. Right? So most people are familiar, a mortar and pestle. A mortar is essentially a bowl usually made out of stone, and a pestle is a rod, usually with some kind of a round end, maybe even a ball on the end, and it's used to grind, right? So a mortar and pestle is used to grind things. Maybe you're making mole. If you're in Mexico, maybe you're grinding spices. Maybe you're grinding whatever you're grinding. Mortar and pestle is used for grinding. 100% grinding. We don't do it on Shabbos. That's one of the prohibited labors. So now the question is a mortar and pestle Muktzeh or not? Is there some other thing that the mortar and pestle can be used for? So Abaye is going to raise the mortar and pestle as an objection to this principle that we can use an item that's normally designed for something prohibited, but we can use it for a permitted labor on Shabbos. And Abaye is going to say, well, we have a baraisa that's included in the Tosefta. So a baraisa is a teaching from the same time period as the Mishnah, but slightly less authoritative. And some baraisas were collected in a collection called the Tosefta, which is sort of like a companion to the Mishnah, and it helps us understand certain Mishnahs. So there was a baraisa in the Tosefta which said that a mortar that has garlic in it, we can move it on Shabbos, but if it doesn't have garlic in it, we may not move it on Shabbos. So Abaye says this seems to accord with the opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah, who did not hold by this idea that we can use, a tool designed for something that's prohibited on Shabbos in order to use it for something that's permitted on Shabbos. Rabbi Nehemiah said, no, we don't do that. If it's primarily designed for labor that's prohibited on Shabbos, it's fully Muktzeh, and we're not going to now go and use it just because it's convenient to us to do something that is permitted. Abaye is also going to raise as an objection to this principle that there's another Mishnah which says that according to Beis Shammai, the academy, the students of Shammai, that we don't use the pestle in a mortar and pestle in order to cut meat on it. I'm having trouble understanding what that looks like. When I think of a pestle, a rod with a ball on the end of it, almost like the shape of a microphone, why am I going to use that to cut meat on top of it? But okay, for some reason they would. So Beis Shammai say we do not use a pestle to cut meat on it, but Beis Hillel say that we do. Now they're talking about raw meat, and right now they're not talking about Shabbos, they're talking about Yom Tov, they're talking about holidays, festivals. Recall that Jewish festivals, Jewish holidays have the same laws as Shabbos, with the one exception is that we can cook. We can prepare food, we can cook on the holiday. So this idea is like we're cutting raw meat here. So if you use the pestle, so according to Beis Hillel, you can use the pestle to cut raw meat on it. According to Beis Shammai, you can't, but both agree that once you've cut meat on it, then it's done. You can't use the pestle anymore. So Abaye is saying, well, according to both of these, the Mishnah about cutting meat on the holiday and the Baraisa about moving the mortar only if it has garlic in it, which would make it a vessel for the garlic, it seems that this principle doesn't work of using the tool for some permitted labor on Shabbos. How can we say that we can do that? So Rabbah answers Abaye's objection by saying that the mortar and pestle is not a generic mortar and pestle. It's not in the same category as most tools because a mortar and pestle is more specialized. And so Rabbah says a mortar and pestle is much more equivalent to a launderer's pin or a launderer's press or the rods. In other words, the tools that people use in the laundry business, right? And people in the laundry business, they're going to be very particular about their pins, presses, and rods. And we can imagine like the one thing they would not want to get on those tools is anything that's dirty at all, because they're going to use those on clean, freshly clean clothes, which they're going to deliver back to the person who paid them to launder the clothes. So this is more akin to the spice merchant's hammer. And a mortar and pestle, even though it's not owned perhaps by a professional who would only use the mortar and pestle in his business, nevertheless, I think Rabbah is saying that a mortar and pestle, even within a home, it's for grinding. We're going to grind things in it. We're going to be very particular about not contaminating it with foods and other things that we might be using on Shabbos. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, it's the hammer of goldsmiths that we can use to crack nuts. But then the Gemara objects, and that's where we get to what I just mentioned before, that the hammer of a spice merchant, he's very particular about it, and so that he doesn't suffer financial loss, he would not use it to crack nuts. And then other examples are going to be given. But first we're going to discuss a needle. Now this is a different issue. This isn't about set aside due to potential financial loss. Here the question is, a needle is normally used for sewing. We don't sew on Shabbos. For sure that's a prohibited labor. But on Shabbos, the needle's not going to be muktzeh. It's not going to be set aside with no use, because we can use the needle to extract a thorn that got under our skin. Now the question is raised, well, what if it's a needle that had the eye of the needle cut off, right? It broke off, like the eye of the needle broke off. Now, we could still use it to extract the thorn. What difference does it make that we broke off the eye of the needle? And the answer is that when you have a needle, that's a utensil, you break off the eye of the needle, you can no longer use it as a utensil, right? There's no place to put the thread. If it's broken this way, maybe you could use it as a pin, but that's actually not discussed here. The basic idea is a needle with an eye in it is used for sewing. You break off the eye of the needle, it's no longer useful for sewing. That matters in the related branch of the law, related but separate, of ritual purity and impurity, the law of Tuma. Right? So we've talked about it a bunch of times. If you're new to this, just a very, very fast introduction. Objects, like people, can become tameh. They can become ritually impure. That doesn't mean they're dirty or they have cooties or they're gross or they're somehow, bad. It just means that they've come into contact with a source of ritual impurity, and they're going to need to be handled. There's going to have to go through some procedure. Some things cannot be made tahor. They cannot be made pure again, but most things can. When they become tameh, maybe they're going to be immersed in water in terms of utensils, or maybe they're going to go through fire. A person is going to be immersed in water, clothing. Other things can become ritually impure. And then before they can be used for certain things, especially when the holy temple is standing, they need to become tahor again. A needle that had its eye broken off is said to be tahor, meaning pure. What that means is it's not automatically, it is automatically pure in the sense that whether it was tameh or not, once you break off the needle, it is no longer what it was. It was a utensil. It might have been tameh, it might have been tahor. But once you break it off, it's like a new object. Now it's just, a thin piece of steel that has a point on it, but it is no longer a needle. And when it loses its identity as a needle, it can no longer be tameh as the utensil that it was. It can no longer become impure. Why is that related to Shabbos? Because we're here in the laws of Muktzeh, we're talking about vessels and utensils that have a purpose during the week, and now we're going to use them for a different purpose on Shabbos. Now, this needle, which was a utensil for sewing, it's no longer a utensil. It's something else. So now that it's no longer a utensil that we're going to sort of repurpose on Shabbos, can we use it to extract the thorn or not? And Abaye says, that's Tuma law. It doesn't matter for Shabbos. And I think it was Rava, who answered him, well, it does matter. Rava says the one who raises the objection well, because there are times when we rely on the status of something with regard to ritual purity or impurity to determine its designation on Shabbos. But in this case, says Abaye, what does the thorn care whether the object that's being used to pull it out has an eye or not, is directly a needle or not? The fact is, you can get the thorn out with it, and people know that. So this has been designated for Shabbos use, in people's mind as this is, you don't have to specifically think to yourself before Shabbos, oh, I might need that to pull a thorn out if it goes into my finger on Shabbos. It's just generally accepted that this needle, whether it has an eye on it or not, could be used to extract a thorn on Shabbos. That completes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 17. And we move right into Mishnah number 2. This one is very short, and it concerns, and I'll take your questions and comments when I finish the Mishnah number 2 and a little bit of Mishnah number 3. So Mishnah number 2 is about a reed, a wooden reed that is used for turning olives in a bundle. It was a tool that they used in ancient times for people who grow olives and make olive oil or whatever else they're going to make out of olives. So this reed that's used for turning olives, either it had a knot in the end of the reed or it didn't. If it had the knot at the end of the reed, so it basically at the end of the reed, it had like a little receptacle that you could use. Just imagine like a stiff, like a piece of straw, a reed that's strong enough, stout enough that you could tie a knot in the end of it, and now it becomes a kind of a spoon that you could get it under an olive and turn an olive over with it. So if it has that knot in the end of the reed, so then it's a vessel, meaning it has a receptacle, like a spoon. You can think of it as either, it's a utensil, but because a spoon has a receptacle in its end, it has a place where something can sit inside of it, then it's also considered a vessel. And if it doesn't have the knot, then it's not a vessel. And so what the Mishnah says is a reed that is used for turning olives in a bundle, if there is a cork-like knot at the top of it, it can become ritually impure, right? So then it's a utensil that can become impure, can become tameh, as a vessel. And if not, and the reason that we're making this distinction is because utensils and vessels have a little bit different laws for becoming impure, and then becoming pure again. A vessel is related to a sack in the Torah, and a utensil is related to other things. So it can become ritually impure, as a vessel, but if it does not have that knot, it cannot become ritually impure because it is not a vessel. However, in either case, it may be moved on Shabbat for use in a permitted action. So now we see, just like the utensil, the needle, which is either a utensil or not a utensil, it could be used on Shabbos. Now we see a vessel that's either a vessel or it's not a vessel, can still be moved, right? So the law is pretty lenient with respect to these Muktzeh items, that we can use them as long as it's for a permitted labor, and we can also move them so that we can get their place on Shabbos. Why are we generally going to be pretty lenient with the laws of Muktzeh? Because it's a rabbinic decree, not a Torah prohibition. Rabbinic decrees serve to protect us from violating Torah prohibitions, but because it's already a fence around the Torah, we're not going to be stringent with them lest we start multiplying laws and it gets a little bit out of control. So from this Mishnah about the reed used to turn olives, we learn two things: that a vessel has a receptacle in it, and number two, even a utensil that is not a vessel may be moved, right? If it doesn't have the knot in it, it's not a vessel, it's a utensil, and it may be moved. Mishnah number 3. Rabbi Yosei says, and now we're getting into a principle, all utensils may be moved on Shabbos except for a large saw and the blade of a plow, since they must be sharp and ready for use, and there is concern that they might be damaged if we use them on Shabbos. One sets them aside from his consciousness, and they may not be used for any other purpose. So now we're back to the hammer of the spice merchant. And we're going to have a list now of the types of items which are set aside because of fear of financial loss if they get damaged. So these are always going to be set aside, and we're not going to use them for anything else. A large saw, which needs to have a sharp blade. The blade of a plow, which were just mentioned in the Mishnah. Also, a launderer's sprinkler. A launderer's sprinkler. And there's a drawing of that here. Whoops. Okay, so that's a launderer's sprinkler. You can see it has holes in it. and I guess it looks a little bit like a sifter. And the launderer, I guess, is going to use it to, I guess they had powdered detergent back then. I'm not sure what they used, but the launderer had a sifter. And what you would not do is use it, for sifting grain, let's say on Yom Tov when you can do food preparation. But the launderer is particular with his sprinkler, so we wouldn't use it. Likewise, a butcher's knife, right? A butcher, he's a professional. Perhaps a chef would be the same thing. They don't want their knives used, right, in amateur hour in the kitchen. Likewise, a shoemaker's knife, a carpenter's knife, I think it's called a carpenter's draw knife. All these tools of craftsmen, of which they're very particular, and they would protect them, and they would never imagine that they would get used for some other purpose than their intended designated use. They remain off limits on Shabbos. Okay. And now we're going to have a little bit, which is so interesting, of the evolution of Muktzeh, right? So in the beginning, according to the first passage that we're going to read, in the beginning, there was very few things that we were allowed to use on Shabbos. Really, that's a hammer. A hammer is used for a labor that's not permitted on Shabbos. We can't move it on Shabbos. Originally, the law was like that. And as we've seen, it became more lenient over time. How did it become more lenient over time? Abaye says, initially, they permitted moving an object whose primary function is for a permitted use for the purpose of utilizing the object itself to perform a permitted action. In other words, you could only touch things on Shabbos that could be used for actions which were permitted on Shabbos. And then they permitted moving an object whose primary function is for a permitted use for the purpose of sitting in or utilizing its place. So they're saying that originally, so something that has a permitted use on Shabbos, let's just say a knife and fork. Okay, so a knife and fork, you're permitted to cut your food with it. But they were saying that originally, if you weren't using it to cut your food, don't touch it, lest you come to carry it somewhere where you shouldn't have carried it, outside into the public domain, etc. So then they added the leniency, well, but if you just need the place where it's sitting, it's a thing that's permitted to touch on Shabbos, but don't touch it unless you're using it. And now we're saying, okay, you can touch it to move it because you need the place where it's sitting. And then, for its place. And then they permitted moving an object whose primary function is for a prohibited use for the purpose of utilizing the object itself to perform a permitted action. Yes. So then they added the idea that, the hammer, which has no normal permitted use on Shabbos, now we can use it to crack nuts, something that's permitted to do using a tool that normally would not be used for that. So they added that. However, for the purpose of utilizing its place, no. So they allowed us to pick up the hammer to crack nuts, but if we just needed the place where the hammer was resting, like because somebody on Friday left it on the dinner table, so we wouldn't touch it unless we had some nuts to crack with it. And then we could put it down somewhere else. And still, utensils that can be held in one hand, yes, they may be moved. However, utensils that can only be held in two hands, no, they may not be moved, in order to signify that there is a prohibition to move certain items. And this prohibition remained intact until they said, all utensils may be moved on Shabbat, even those that can only be held in both hands. And so that was the kind of evolution of the growing leniency of moving items on Shabbos. Rava disagreed with Abaye a little bit in terms of what you can do with one hand or two hands, and he sort of added that at a certain point they allowed somebody to move something from the sun into the shade, right? So there, maybe you're talking about somebody who's, I'm a little unclear about that. You're going to protect something by moving it from the sun into the shade. So I guess, I wonder if even the spice merchant's hammer, which might be damaged if it's sitting out in the sun, you might be allowed to move it into the shade. You're not allowed to use it to crack nuts because he would never have done that, but he certainly wouldn't want it sitting out in the sun, and maybe you need the place where it is. So they differ a little bit about how things evolved. But it evolved, right? And so it became much more lenient about what we can move. Now, this is under the idea that in the beginning we could hardly move anything, and over time the law of Muktzeh became more and more lenient. But actually, it's not that in the beginning everything was super strict and then it eased up over time. It actually turns out that when the laws eased up, it was not an innovation, but rather a return to the way things were before a bunch of stringencies were added to the system. Why were the stringencies added? Rabbi Hanina said, this Mishnah was taught in the days of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, a period when many stringent decrees were issued with regard to Shabbat prohibitions. As it is written, this is the prophet Nehemiah or Nehemiah, in those days I saw in Judea some treading wine presses on Shabbat and bringing in heaps of grain and lading donkeys with them, as also wine, grapes, figs, and all manner of burdens which are brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I forewarned them on that day when they sold food. That's Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15. Since the people treated the sanctity of Shabbos with disdain, Nehemiah instituted many stringencies with regard to all the laws of Shabbos in order to educate the people to observe Shabbos. So those stringencies were not originally part of God's plan, let's say, but they were necessary in that generation because the people had become so lax in their Shabbos observance. And so he passed a whole bunch of new laws to make people think, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. Why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? Because it's Shabbos, right? To get Shabbos in their minds. The fact that they were hearing about new laws made Shabbos more central in people's minds, and Shabbos observance increased. Over time, the sages came to see that the people were being much better about observing Shabbos than they had been in the generation of Nehemiah. And then at that point, they started easing back to the way things were and allowing people. The idea is to observe Shabbos, but these objects that might lead us to do prohibited labors, the people got it. They got the message. Okay, we can't do those prohibited labors. We can move these objects because we need their place, or we can use those objects only to do permitted labors. And some of those we're not going to touch or move at all, except in very rare circumstances, because we understand that those are really associated with the work week. They're valuable. We wouldn't want them harmed, and they're just about the work week, right? So a cell phone on Shabbos, presumably it's hard and heavy enough that I could crack nuts with it. But I would never think to do that. And so the cell phone on Shabbos is fully muktzeh. We put it somewhere before Shabbos, and we don't touch it again until Shabbos ends. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me look at your comments and questions. I don't see any. Nina hasn't passed any along. Brian of Bloomfield says, rarely does a prop master get to show off in class. Are you a prop master, Brian? That's so cool. And she's saying it's for the starch. The launderer's sprinkler is for sprinkling the starch in the old days of laundry. Thank you. That's awesome. And Bill is saying, it also seems to me that the spice merchant's hammer being used to crack nuts is also, frankly, just too close to the regular use of it. Good. So it's a little bit too close to what it might be used for. We can crack nuts. I mentioned this, I think, 2 days ago. Because you might think, how can you crack nuts on Shabbos? You're extracting the edible from the inedible, which is a prohibited labor. And if you did it in any kind of quantity or for a later meal, it would be prohibited. But just to eat yourself, just like on your plate with your knife and fork, you can separate, foods that you think are edible from the ones that you don't like to eat. Of course, that's permitted. And likewise, we can crack open nuts just so that we can eat what's inside, not to do a process of separating a bunch of innards of the walnuts from their shells. By the way, let me mention, if you missed it last night, it's going to be out. If you're into podcasts, it'll be out on the Accidental Talmudist podcast next week. But last night we had it as a Facebook Live, a conversation that I had with Naz Yassin, who's an Arab Israeli who's huge on social media. He has a show called Naz Daily on Facebook. He produced a 1-minute video every day for 1,000 days. And it just got huge. He has, 11 million followers on Facebook and another 15 million on other social media platforms. And he is such a positive and inspiring and beautiful soul. And we had a beautiful conversation about all kinds of stuff. So that's in the Accidental Talmudist page on Facebook. If you want to see that video, it's available there. People were loving it. So that's why I'm mentioning it. The feedback was tremendous. But if you prefer to hear conversations by podcast, it'll appear on the podcast platforms on Apple Podcasts and Google Play and Stitcher and whichever other ones we use. You can learn more about the Accidental Talmudist podcast on our website, accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, that is what I've got for us today. I'm not seeing any other comments or questions, so it's been great to be with you. Tomorrow's show is going to be at a different time. I'm tied up tomorrow afternoon, so it's going to be at noon on Wednesday, like the Friday schedule. This week we'll do Wednesday at noon Pacific and Friday at noon Pacific. Just a couple more questions came in late. Can you move any muktzeh by holding it in an odd way? Yes, Mike, that's what I mentioned earlier. If you have to move something, it's good when you need something for its place. It is good to pick it up like in a weird way, a way that you normally wouldn't pick it up, to demonstrate that you know that this thing is not for use on Shabbos and you just need its place. And Sheila Ritter says, if we need to use a cell phone for an emergency on Shabbos, is that okay? And I think the basic answer is, what's the nature of the emergency? Is it to save a life? Yes, we desecrate Shabbos to save a life. Is it to save a business deal? No, we're not going to do that on Shabbos. I think that would be the general principle, and hopefully that makes sense. All right, my friends, great being with you this evening. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow at